For 40 years Thomas Wright mopped the floors of death row. He cleaned blood after executions. He scrubbed cells after inmates took their own lives. He witnessed 127 men take their final walks. And for 40 years he carried a secret that ate him alive from the inside. On his last day before retirement, Thomas walked into cell 9, looked at the young man scheduled to die in 72 hours, and said 5 words that would change everything. "I'm the one who did it. Stay with me, because this story will show you that sometimes the truth comes too late, and sometimes it comes just in time." Before we dive deep, hit that subscribe button, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because this story will leave you speechless. Thomas Wright was 68 years old on his final day at Riverside State Penitentiary. He arrived at 4:30 in the morning, just like he had every day for the past 40 years. The same worn work boots, the same faded gray jumpsuit that marked him as maintenance staff, the same battered lunchbox his wife had packed for him back when she was still alive. Thomas had seen 3 wardens come and go. He'd watched the prison expand from 800 inmates to over 2,000. He'd seen technology change everything except the fundamental nature of what happened in this place. Men came in, some of them left, some of them died here, and Thomas cleaned up after all of it. The other maintenance workers had thrown him a small party the day before. Nothing fancy, just cake in the break room, and a plaque that read 40 years of dedicated service. Thomas had smiled and thanked everyone, accepting handshakes from people who'd worked alongside him for decades, but never really knew him. How could they? Thomas Wright had spent 40 years being invisible. The old janitor who showed up before dawn, and left after dark. The quiet man who never complained, never caused problems, never drew attention to himself. That was exactly how Thomas wanted it. Invisible men don't get asked questions. Invisible men don't have to explain themselves. Invisible men can carry secrets that would destroy them if anyone knew. Thomas pushed his mop bucket through the security checkpoint, nodding at Officer Martinez who'd been working the early shift for the past 12 years. "Morning, Thomas. Last day, huh? How's it feel?" Martinez asked, barely looking up from his crossword puzzle. "Feels like every other day," Thomas replied, his voice rough from years of breathing in cleaning chemicals and keeping words inside. Martinez chuckled. 40 years in this place and you're still the same quiet old guy. Most people can't wait to get out of here. You gonna miss it?" Thomas paused, considering the question. There were things he'd miss. The routine, the familiar rhythm of his work, the inmates who'd treated him with respect over the years. But mostly, Thomas knew he'd miss the constant reminder of what his silence had cost. Every day walking these halls had been a form of penance. Leaving felt like escaping punishment he'd never properly served. "Guess I'll find out tomorrow," Thomas said, pushing his bucket forward. The wheels squeaked in the quiet hallway, a sound so familiar it was like breathing. Thomas made his way to death row, the section of the prison he'd started cleaning 30 years ago when the previous janitor had retired. Death row was different from the general population areas, quieter, more intense. The men here lived with certain knowledge of their end date. Some had been waiting for decades, their executions delayed by appeals and legal challenges. Others had exhausted all options and were simply counting down their final days. Thomas knew them all, not their crimes, necessarily, though he'd overheard enough over the years to piece together most stories. He knew them as human beings. He knew which ones read constantly, escaping into books. He knew which ones exercised obsessively, maintaining bodies that would soon be destroyed. He knew which ones had found religion, and which ones had lost it entirely. And he knew David Santos, cell 9, death row, 33 years old, scheduled for execution in 72 hours. Thomas had been cleaning David's cell every Tuesday for the past 15 years, since the young man first arrived on death row at age 18, convicted of murdering a store owner during a robbery, sentenced to death despite his insistence that he was innocent, that he'd been nowhere near the store that night, that the real killer had framed him. Thomas knew David's story by heart. He'd listened to it evolve over 15 years, from desperate protestations of innocence to resigned acceptance to something that looked almost like peace. David had stopped filing appeals 3 years ago. He'd stopped accepting visits from his mother 2 years ago, telling her through the glass that he couldn't bear to see her cry anymore. He'd requested an execution date 6 months ago, telling the warden he was tired of waiting to die and wanted to get it over with. Thomas reached cell 9 and stopped, looking through the bars at the young man sitting on his bunk. David was staring at the wall where he'd been crossing off days on a makeshift calendar. 72 boxes left. 72 hours until the state would inject poison into his veins and stop his heart. "Morning, Mr. Wright," David said without turning around. "Last day of work for you, Wright. Heard the guards talking about it." "That's right," Thomas replied. Unlocking the cell door, David stood and moved to the corner, assuming the position he'd learned 15 years ago. Arms out, face the wall, don't make any sudden movements. Thomas had seen this routine thousands of times. The small humiliations of prison life that became so automatic that inmates and guards alike stopped noticing them. But Thomas noticed. He always noticed. "You don't have to do that," Thomas said quietly. "It's my last day. I'm not worried about protocol." David turned, surprise flickering across his face. In 15 years, Thomas had never deviated from procedure. The old janitor was famous for following rules, for keeping his head down, for never crossing lines. "You feeling sentimental, old man?" David asked, a slight smile on his face. "Something like that," Thomas said. He stepped into the cell and closed the door behind him, leaving his mop and bucket outside. This was already breaking rules. No maintenance staff alone in cells with inmates. Doors always open during cleaning. But Thomas was done following rules. He'd followed them for 40 years, while an innocent man sat in prison. That was enough. David sat back down on his bunk, gesturing to the small stool that served as the cell's only other furniture. Thomas sat, feeling his knees crack. 68 years old. Too old for mopping floors. Too old for carrying secrets. Too old for cowardice. "Mr. Wright, you okay?" David asked, concern creasing his young face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." In a way, Thomas thought he had. Every time he looked at David Santos, he saw the ghost of the man David should have been, the life he should have lived, the future that had been stolen from him. And Thomas saw the ghost of another man, Robert Chen, the store owner, the man whose death had set all of this in motion 30 years ago. "David," Thomas began, his voice shaking. "I need to tell you something. Something I should have said 15 years ago. Something I should have said 30 years ago. But I was a coward. I was weak, and my weakness cost you your life." David leaned forward, confusion replacing concern. "What are you talking about?" Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, folded and refolded so many times the creases had worn thin. He'd written it 17 years ago, before David even arrived at the prison. A confession he'd never had the courage to deliver. "I know you didn't kill Robert Chen," Thomas said. The words hung in the air like smoke. "I know you're innocent." David's face went pale. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I was there that night," Thomas replied. "April 3, 1985. I was there when Robert Chen died. And you weren't." David stood abruptly, his stool scraping against the concrete floor. "What are you saying? Are you saying you saw the real killer? Are you saying you could have testified?" Thomas shook his head slowly, tears beginning to stream down his weathered face. "I'm saying I was the killer, David. I'm the one who killed Robert Chen. You've been in prison for 15 years, waiting to die, for a crime I committed." The cell fell silent, except for the distant sound of other inmates stirring in their morning routines. David stared at Thomas as if seeing him for the first time. "You," he whispered. "You killed him?" Thomas nodded. "I was a different man then, 43 years old, drinking too much, gambling away money my wife and I didn't have, desperate and stupid and convinced that one robbery could solve all my problems. I went into Chen's convenience store with a gun I'd bought off the street, told myself I'd just scare him, just take the money and run. But Chen fought back. He had a baseball bat behind the counter and he swung it at me. We struggled. The gun went off. I didn't mean to kill him. I swear to God I didn't mean to. But he was dead and I was holding a smoking gun and I panicked. I ran, left him bleeding on the floor, left the gun because I was too scared to think straight." David sank back onto his bunk, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. "The gun," he said slowly. "That's what they used to convict me. They said my fingerprints were on it." Thomas nodded again. "I'd bought that gun 2 weeks earlier from a dealer named Marcus. Same Marcus who sold guns to half the neighborhood, including you. You'd bought a gun from him 3 months before the murder for protection. Your prints were in the system from a prior arrest for a fight at school. When the police tested the murder weapon, your prints came up because you'd handled other guns Marcus sold. The prosecution built their whole case around it. I know, David said, his voice hollow. I told them I'd never even seen that specific gun. Told them I'd bought a different model from Marcus. But they didn't believe me. Said I was lying. Said the forensics didn't lie. Thomas wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I watched your trial, sat in the back of the courtroom every day. Told myself that if you were acquitted, I'd confess. But when you were convicted, when they sentenced you to death, I convinced myself it was fate. That maybe you'd done other things, broken other laws. And this was just karma catching up. I told myself anything to justify my silence. David's hands were shaking now, clenched into fists on his knees. Do you have any idea what you've done? Any idea what the last 15 years have been like? Knowing I was innocent. Watching my mother age 30 years in 15. Accepting that I was going to die for something I didn't do. I know, Thomas said quietly. And I'm sorry. Those words are worthless, I know. Nothing I say can give you back what I took. But I'm here now because you have 72 hours left and I can't let you die for my crime. I won't let you die for my crime. David laughed, a bitter sound that echoed off the concrete walls. You won't let me. You're 40 years too late, old man. My appeals are exhausted. My execution date is set. Even if you confess now, they'll never stop it in time. The system doesn't work that fast. Thomas stood, pulling more papers from his pocket. These are copies of the original police reports. I've been collecting documentation for years. Statements from people who saw me that night. Receipts showing I purchased supplies similar to what the killer used. A letter from my wife before she died, detailing my confession to her the night after the murder. And this, he pulled out a small plastic bag. This is the shirt I was wearing that night. I've kept it hidden for 30 years. There's still blood on it. Robert Chen's blood. DNA testing can prove it. David stared at the evidence spread across his bunk. Why now? He asked. Why did you wait until 72 hours before my execution? Why not last month? Last year? 15 years ago. Thomas sat back down heavily. Cowardice, he said simply. Every day I told myself tomorrow. Tomorrow I'd come forward. Tomorrow I'd make it right. But tomorrow kept coming and I kept finding reasons to wait. I told myself my wife needed me. Then she died and I told myself I was too old to go to prison. Then I realized I didn't have much time left anyway. And what did it matter? But these last few weeks, knowing your execution was coming, I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes I saw your face. Saw your mother's face when they told her you'd been executed. Saw Robert Chen's widow who deserved justice but got the wrong man punished. Saw my own face in the mirror getting older while you were dying for my crime. David picked up the plastic bag, looking at the faded bloodstains on the fabric. This might not be enough, he said. Even with all this evidence, there's no guarantee they'll stop the execution. The legal system moves slow, and my time is up in 3 days. Then we make them listen. Thomas said with a determination that surprised even himself. We make so much noise they can't ignore us. I'll confess to the warden. I'll confess to the police. I'll confess to every reporter who'll listen. I'll stand in front of the prison gates and scream the truth if I have to. You're not dying in 72 hours, David. Not if I can help it. Over the next hour, Thomas laid out everything. Every detail of that night 30 years ago. The route he took to the store. The words he'd said to Robert Chen. The exact sequence of events that led to the shooting. Details that had never been made public. That only the real killer could know. David listened with an intensity that made Thomas's skin crawl. Here was a man hearing the truth about the night that destroyed his life. Delivered by the person responsible, with 72 hours left to live. When Thomas finished, David was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke. There's something you need to know. When I was first convicted, I was angry. Wanted revenge on whoever really did it. Spent years fantasizing about what I'd do if I ever found the real killer. But over time, something changed. I found faith, started reading the Bible, started understanding forgiveness in a way I never had before. Thomas felt hope kindle in his chest. So you forgive me? David looked at him, and Thomas saw something in the young man's eyes that made him want to weep. "I'm working on it," David said carefully. "Forgiveness isn't a switch you flip, it's a process. Right now, I'm grateful you came forward. Grateful I might not die for your crime. But forgiving you for stealing 15 years of my life, for the suffering you caused my mother, for every night I laid awake knowing I was innocent but helpless. That's going to take time. Time I might not have. Then we better get started, making sure you have that time," Thomas said. He stood and called for the guard. Officer Peters arrived, looking suspicious when he saw Thomas inside the cell with the door closed. "Right. You know the rules. What are you doing in there?" "Making a confession," Thomas said clearly. "I need you to call the warden immediately. Tell him that I have information about the Robert Chen murder from 1985. Tell him that David Santos is innocent, and that I can prove it. Tell him that if he doesn't get down here in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to start shouting loud enough for every inmate in this facility to hear me." Peters stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "Thomas, what the hell are you talking about?" "Just call him," Thomas said. "And you might want to call the police too. Because in about 5 minutes, I'm going to confess to murder." The next 12 hours were chaos. Warden Morrison arrived, furious at being summoned at 5 in the morning. His fury turned to shock as Thomas calmly laid out his confession. The police were called. Detectives who'd worked the original case arrived, now retired, but pulled back in for this bombshell. Thomas repeated his story again and again, each time with the same unwavering details. He showed them the evidence he'd collected: the blood-stained shirt, the documentation, the letter from his wife. They tested the blood on the shirt. Rushed DNA analysis because the clock was ticking on David's execution. The results came back in 8 hours, faster than anyone thought possible. The blood matched Robert Chen. But more importantly, there were traces of DNA from the person who'd worn the shirt. It matched Thomas Wright, not David Santos. The district attorney was called. The governor's office was notified. News crews started gathering outside the prison as word leaked about a potential wrongful conviction on death row. Legal experts were consulted about stopping an execution this close to the scheduled time. David sat in his cell through all of it, barely speaking, processing the reality that he might actually survive past 72 hours. His mother was contacted. Rebecca Santos, now 67 years old, who'd spent 15 years watching her son waste away on death row. She broke down on the phone when they told her there might be hope. She'd never given up believing in her son's innocence, even when David himself had given up. With 48 hours until execution, the governor issued a stay, indefinite postponement pending investigation of new evidence. David Santos would not die on schedule. Thomas Wright was arrested and charged with the 1985 murder of Robert Chen. He was processed into the same prison where he'd worked for 40 years, now wearing orange instead of gray. The media exploded with the story. Janitor confesses to 30-year-old murder, saves innocent man from execution. Pictures of Thomas in handcuffs. Pictures of David breaking down in tears when he was told about the stay of execution. Pictures of Rebecca Santos collapsing in relief outside the courthouse. The legal process moved forward with unusual speed, driven by public pressure and the obvious injustice. Thomas pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and obstruction of justice. His attorney argued for leniency based on his age, his decades of remorse, and his ultimate decision to come forward. The judge was unmoved. "You took a man's life," the judge said during sentencing. "Then you let another man spend 15 years on death row for your crime. Your confession came far too late to show true remorse. It shows only that your conscience finally overpowered your cowardice." Thomas Wright was sentenced to 25 years in prison. At 68 years old, it was effectively a life sentence. Thomas would die in prison, just as he'd always known he would, but at least now it would be for his own crime, not as a free man haunted by another man's suffering. David's case went back through the courts. With Thomas's confession, the DNA evidence, and the obvious miscarriage of justice, his conviction was vacated. 15 years, and 2 months after entering prison, David Santos walked out a free man. His mother waited for him outside the gates, along with reporters and supporters and advocacy groups who'd taken up his cause. David embraced Rebecca, both of them crying, both of them damaged by what they'd endured but finally free. In the weeks that followed, David struggled to adjust to freedom. 15 years in prison, most of them on death row, had fundamentally changed him. He was 33 years old, but felt ancient. Simple things overwhelmed him. Crowds, traffic, making choices about what to eat for dinner. The world had moved on while he'd been frozen in time. But he had something now that he'd never had before: a future. The state offered him compensation for wrongful imprisonment. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it gave David resources to rebuild. He found an apartment, started therapy to process his trauma, began the slow work of figuring out who David Santos was when he wasn't an inmate waiting to die. His mother helped him navigate this new world. Rebecca had aged dramatically during her son's imprisonment, her hair gone white, her face deeply lined, but having David home brought light back to her eyes. She'd never remarried after David's father left, had devoted her entire life to fighting for her son's freedom. Now she devoted herself to helping him heal. 1 month after his release, David did something unexpected. He requested permission to visit Thomas Wright in prison. The request was denied at first. Victim and perpetrator contact was complicated legally, but David persisted, and eventually, with proper supervision, the visit was approved. They met in a small visiting room, separated by glass, speaking through phones. Thomas looked older, thinner, worn down by guilt and incarceration in a way that 40 years of freedom had never done. David looked stronger, like freedom was slowly filling out the hollow spaces prison had carved into him. "Thank you for coming," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. "I didn't think you'd ever want to see me again." "I wasn't sure I would," David admitted. "Part of me hated you so much I wanted you to suffer the way I suffered. But another part of me knows that you gave me back my life. Late, yes. Painfully late. But you could have stayed silent. You could have retired and taken your secret to the grave. You chose truth instead. That matters." Thomas wiped his eyes. "I'm so sorry, for all of it. For killing Robert Chen. For letting you take the blame. For every day you spent in that cell. I know sorry isn't enough. I know I can never make it right. But I need you to know that I will carry this guilt until the day I die." David was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking a lot about forgiveness," he finally said. "About what it means. About whether I can forgive you. My faith teaches that forgiveness is essential. That holding on to hatred only poisons the person holding it. But it also teaches that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean what you did was okay. It means I'm choosing not to let what you did define the rest of my life." Thomas nodded, understanding. "I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I'm going to spend every day I have left trying to make something good come from this horror. I've been talking to advocacy groups about wrongful convictions, sharing my story to push for better forensic standards, trying to help other people who might be where you were. It's not redemption. I can't redeem this, but maybe I can prevent it from happening to someone else." Over the following months, David and Thomas maintained occasional contact. Not friendship, exactly. The wound was too deep for that. But something else. A complicated connection forged from tragedy and truth. David became an advocate for criminal justice reform, speaking publicly about his experience. He testified before legislative committees about the death penalty, about wrongful convictions, about the need for better legal representation for the poor. His story, combined with Thomas's confession, sparked renewed debate about capital punishment in Texas. How many other innocent people were on death row? How many other cases relied on questionable evidence or faulty assumptions? David's case became a rallying point for those who opposed the death penalty entirely. Rebecca Santos started a foundation in her son's name, providing legal support for inmates claiming wrongful conviction. She worked tirelessly, driven by the knowledge that somewhere out there, other mothers were going through what she'd endured. Other sons and daughters were sitting in cells for crimes they didn't commit. Thomas, from his prison cell, contributed what he could. He wrote detailed accounts of how he'd evaded detection for 30 years, the mistakes investigators had made, the assumptions that led them to David instead of him. His writings became part of training materials for law enforcement, teaching new investigators about confirmation bias and the importance of thorough investigation. 1 year after his release, David met with Robert Chen's widow, Linda. It was a meeting he dreaded but knew he needed. Linda was 72 years old now, her husband dead for 30 years, her grief complicated by the knowledge that the wrong man had been punished. "I don't know what to say to you," David told her honestly. "I didn't kill your husband, but I paid for his death anyway. And the man who did kill him is now punishing himself in ways the justice system never could." Linda looked at this young man whose life had been destroyed by her husband's murder. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "Sorry that catching my husband's killer came at such a terrible cost to you. Sorry that the system failed both of us." Robert would have hated knowing an innocent man suffered for his death. He was a good man. He would have wanted real justice, not just convenient justice. They talked for 2 hours, sharing grief and anger, and the complicated feelings that came from being connected by tragedy. When they parted, both felt something shift. Not healing, exactly. Wounds this deep didn't heal completely. But acknowledgement. Understanding. A shared recognition that they'd both been victimized by violence, and by a system that prioritized closure over accuracy. 2 years after his release, David started dating someone he'd met through his advocacy work. Anna was a law student who'd attended one of his speeches and been moved by his story. They took things slow, both aware that David's trauma made relationships complicated. But there was genuine connection between them. Anna didn't see him as a victim or a symbol. She saw him as a person, as David. For the first time since his arrest at 18, David felt like he might actually have a future worth living. He proposed to Anna on the 3rd anniversary of his release, at the beach where he'd spent the first day of his freedom. She said yes. Thomas heard about the engagement through a letter David sent him. The old man cried in his cell, grateful that something good was growing from the ashes of his terrible choices. He was 71 now, his health declining. Prison was hard on old men. But Thomas faced each day with the same determination he'd brought to 40 years of janitorial work. He attended every program available, took classes, helped other older inmates navigate the system, tried to be useful in whatever small ways he could. He would die here. He'd accepted that. But he would die having finally told the truth. On the 5th anniversary of David's release, David and Anna got married. Rebecca cried through the entire ceremony. David had invited Thomas, knowing the man couldn't attend but wanting him to know he was thought of. Thomas received the invitation in his cell, and placed it on his wall next to a picture of David that had appeared in a magazine article about wrongful convictions. These were his reminders. His evidence that confession, however late, mattered. That same year, Thomas's health took a serious turn. Lung cancer, likely from decades of breathing in industrial cleaning chemicals. The doctors gave him 6 months to a year. Thomas refused treatment. What was the point? He was serving a life sentence anyway. Let the cancer take him. It would be faster and less painful than growing old behind bars. When David heard about the diagnosis, he requested another visit. They sat across from each other. Thomas visibly frailer than their last meeting. "You're dying," David said. Not a question. Thomas nodded. "Few months, probably. Doctors say I should get my affairs in order." David leaned forward. "I need to tell you something before you go. Something I've been working on for the past year. I've forgiven you." Thomas's breath caught. David continued. "Not because what you did was forgivable. It wasn't. You took a life. You let me suffer for it. Those are facts that don't change. But I've forgiven you because holding on to hatred was killing me almost as much as death row did. I've forgiven you because my faith demands it. I've forgiven you because you finally did the right thing, even though it cost you everything. And I've forgiven you because I've seen what you've done with your confession, the advocacy work, the awareness, the changes you've helped create. You can't undo the past, but you've tried to shape a better future. That matters." Thomas was openly sobbing now, shoulders shaking, face buried in his hands. "I don't deserve this. I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Maybe not," David agreed. "But I'm giving it anyway. Not for you, for me, because I refuse to let what you did continue to poison my life. I'm married now. I have a future, and I'm not going to waste it on hatred." Thomas looked up, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for being a better man than I ever was." "That's the thing," David said gently. You taught me something important. You taught me that it's never too late to tell the truth. Never too late to try to make things right. You did it at 68 years old. If you can find courage that late in life, then none of us have an excuse for staying silent about our wrongs. 4 months later, Thomas Wright died in the prison infirmary. He was 72 years old. He died with a picture of David and Anna's wedding in his hand, and a letter from Rebecca Santos, thanking him for giving her son back. His funeral was small. A few former co-workers attended. David and Anna came, sitting in the back of the chapel. Rebecca came too, which surprised everyone. She stood at the end and said something that stunned the gathered mourners. Thomas Wright took my son from me for 15 years. He caused my family immeasurable pain, but he also gave my son back. He could have stayed silent, could have taken his secret to the grave. Instead, he chose truth, even though it cost him his freedom. That takes courage. I can't forgive what he did, but I can acknowledge what he tried to do to make it right. That's worth something. David stood at Thomas's grave after everyone else had left. He thought about the janitor who'd mopped floors for 40 years while carrying an unbearable secret. The man who'd finally found the courage to tell the truth with 72 hours left on the clock. The person whose confession had saved David's life, while ending his own freedom. It's complicated, David said quietly to the headstone. You're a murderer and a coward and the reason I lost 15 years, but you're also the reason I got my life back. You're the reason I'm standing here free instead of buried in a prison cemetery. I don't know if you found peace before you died. I hope you did. I hope you knew that your confession mattered, that it changed things, that it saved me. David placed a flower on the grave, and walked back to where Anna waited by the car. They drove home to the life they were building together. The life that existed because an old janitor had finally decided that telling the truth mattered more than protecting himself. 7 years after his release, David and Anna had a son. They named him Robert, after Robert Chen, and Thomas, after Thomas Wright. Robert Thomas Santos, a name that carried both the victim and the perpetrator, both the tragedy and the redemption. The boy would grow up knowing the story, knowing that his father had nearly been executed for a crime he didn't commit, knowing that an old janitor had saved his father's life by confessing to murder, knowing that justice was complicated and truth was powerful and courage could come at any age. David continued his advocacy work, now with even more urgency. He'd survived death row. He'd been given back his life. He owed it to others still trapped in the system to fight for them. He worked with the Innocence Project, investigating wrongful convictions. He testified at parole hearings for inmates who turned their lives around. He spoke at schools and churches and community centers about the importance of truth and the danger of assumptions. His speeches drew crowds of people hungry for hope in a broken system. Students who wanted to become lawyers dedicated to justice. Families of inmates who believed their loved ones were innocent. Even some law enforcement officers who recognized that the system they served sometimes failed spectacularly. David's story became a teaching tool in law schools across the country, studied as a case example of everything that could go wrong in a criminal prosecution. The flawed forensic evidence, the overworked public defender, the prosecutor more interested in conviction rates than truth, the appeals process that failed to catch obvious problems. David didn't just tell his story, he used it to educate. He broke down every mistake that led to his conviction, every assumption that kept him on death row, every systemic failure that nearly cost him his life, and he did it without bitterness, which made his message even more powerful. People expected anger from a man who'd lost 15 years. Instead, they got thoughtful analysis and a determination to fix what was broken. The foundation Rebecca started grew beyond what anyone expected. It began as a small operation working on a handful of cases, but within 5 years, it had helped exonerate 12 wrongfully convicted individuals. Each case followed a similar pattern to David's: poor defendants, questionable evidence, rushed trials, appeals that went nowhere until someone bothered to dig deeper. Rebecca worked tirelessly despite her advancing age, driven by the knowledge that every person they freed was someone else's David, someone else's son or daughter waiting to die for something they didn't do. She hired investigators, partnered with law schools that ran innocence clinics, and created a network of volunteer attorneys willing to take on seemingly hopeless cases. The foundation became her life's work, her way of transforming the worst experience of her life into something that mattered. And sometimes, late at night, when Anna and little Robert were asleep, David would think about Thomas Wright, the old man mopping floors, carrying his secret for 40 years, finally finding the courage to speak up with 72 hours left on the clock. David thought about how close he'd come to dying for someone else's crime, how his son would never have been born, how his mother would have spent the rest of her life mourning him, all because one man had made a terrible choice and then compounded it with decades of silence. But he also thought about the power of confession. The way Thomas's truth, however late, had rippled outward, saving David's life, changing laws, helping other wrongful conviction cases get the attention they deserved, proving that redemption, while never erasing harm, could still create good from evil. Dear viewers, this is the story of Thomas Wright and David Santos, a janitor and a death row inmate, a murderer and his innocent victim, a coward who found courage and a condemned man who found freedom. Their story reminds us that truth has power, even when it comes decades too late, that one person's decision to finally speak up can change everything, that justice isn't simple, and redemption is complicated, and sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit what we've done wrong, even when the cost is our own freedom. Thomas Wright mopped the floors of death row for 40 years, carrying a secret that ate him alive. On his last day, he finally set that burden down. He saved David Santos from execution, but he also saved himself from a lifetime of living with unconfessed sin. In the end, both men found a kind of freedom. David's was literal, walking out of prison gates into sunshine. Thomas's was spiritual, finally unburdening his soul before death. And somewhere in that complicated space between victim and perpetrator, between crime and confession, between justice and mercy, both men found something like peace. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button, share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to tell the truth, and remember that sometimes the most important thing we can do is speak up, even when the cost is everything we have.